Flashing red and blue lights in a rear-view mirror marked just Chapter 1 of a nightmare exposing dark corners of small-town authority. What happens when an arrogant cop targets a completely wrong driver, a decorated 3-star general commanding our nation's military? This isn't merely a tale of abused power. It is a masterclass in absolute, devastating karma. Stick around to see how one single phone call to Pentagon headquarters shattered a rigged system overnight and permanently ended a predator's career. Lieutenant General Albert Reynolds had navigated war zones in the Middle East, coordinated multinational defense strategies in Brussels, and briefed the President of the United States in the Situation Room. Yet, as he cruised down the desolate stretch of Route 29 in rural Virginia, he was about to face an entirely different breed of hostility. It was a crisp Thursday evening in late October. Reynolds was officially on a rare 2-week leave, returning to Washington, D.C. from a quiet family reunion in North Carolina. He was dressed for comfort, wearing a faded gray University of Michigan sweatshirt, well-worn denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed leather loafers. The only hint of his true identity was the subtle silver West Point class ring on his right hand, and the heavy, custom-engraved dog tags resting coolly against his chest beneath the cotton fabric. He was driving a pristine, late-model charcoal Chevy Tahoe. It wasn't flashy, but it was spotless, well-maintained, and radiated a quiet authority, much like the man behind the wheel. The dashboard digital speedometer read exactly 55 miles per hour. The cruise control was set. Reynolds was listening to a low-volume John Coltrane track, letting the complex saxophone rhythms wash over the lingering stress of his high-stakes Pentagon assignment as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. 10 miles outside the jurisdiction of Oakhaven County, a notorious speed trap known among locals as a jurisdictional black hole, a black-and-white Ford Police Interceptor sat idling behind a billboard. Inside the cruiser, Officer Clayton Higgins was bored, irritable, and looking for a reason to exercise his authority. Higgins was a man whose ambition had vastly outpaced his competence. Passed over for promotion 3 times, he ruled his 2-mile stretch of asphalt with the petty tyranny of a man desperate for respect he hadn't earned. Beside him sat Rookie Officer Brent Miller, a 23-year-old fresh out of the academy, still clinging to the idealistic belief that the badge was meant to help people. As the Chevy Tahoe glided past the billboard, Higgins's eyes narrowed. The streetlights briefly illuminated the driver's seat. Higgins saw a black man in a high-end, late-model SUV. "Look at this guy," Higgins muttered, dropping the cruiser into drive. "Tahoe like that costs 70, 80 grand, easy. Let's see what he's running from." "Radar didn't clock him speeding, Clayton," Miller pointed out nervously, looking at the dash display. "He was dead on 55. "He crossed the yellow line," Higgins lied smoothly, flipping the switch for the light bar. "Failure to maintain a lane. That's reasonable suspicion, Rookie. Take notes." In the Tahoe, Reynolds saw the Christmas tree of lights erupt in his rearview mirror. A deep, weary sigh escaped his lips. He checked his dashcam, a high-end Garmin unit installed securely behind his rearview mirror, and verified it was recording both audio and video. He signaled smoothly, pulling the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder with textbook precision. He shifted into park, turned off the engine, rolled down all 4 windows, a standard courtesy to ensure the officer felt safe, and placed his large, calloused hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. He knew the drill. He had grown up in the Deep South. A uniform and 3 stars on his collar protected him at the Pentagon. But out here on a dark highway, in civilian clothes, he was just another target. Higgins approached the driver's side, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his sidearm. Miller hung back near the rear quarter panel, his flashlight trained on the back seat. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Higgins barked, leaning in close, invading Reynolds' personal space. The officer didn't offer a greeting, didn't state the reason for the stop. Just a command, dripping with contempt. "Good evening, officer," Reynolds replied. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, calibrated by decades of commanding thousands of troops. It was entirely devoid of fear, which instantly irritated Higgins. "I didn't ask for a weather report," Higgins snapped. "I said license and registration, now." Reynolds moved slowly, telegraphing every motion. "My wallet is in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for them now." Higgins sneered. "Just get them, and no sudden moves, unless you want to find out how fast I can draw." Reynolds retrieved his leather wallet. Inside, nestled behind his Virginia driver's license, was his olive-green Department of Defense Common Access card, clearly displaying his rank of Lieutenant General. He made a split-second tactical decision. He slid out only the civilian driver's license and the rental agreement for the Tahoe. If this officer was operating in good faith, the civilian ID would suffice. If he wasn't, revealing his military rank too early would just give the man an excuse to claim the ID was fake. Reynolds wanted to see exactly how this department operated. Higgins snatched the cards from Reynolds's fingers. He shined his harsh maglite directly into Reynolds's eyes. "Albert, huh? Where you headed, Artie?" "Home," Reynolds said simply, squinting against the glare but not looking away. "To Washington." "Washington," Higgins mocked. "Long way from home. Whose car is this? You borrow it from a friend? Your boss?" "It is a rental," Reynolds replied evenly, "as the paperwork in your hand indicates." "Don't get smart with me," Higgins warned, tapping the flashlight against the doorframe. "You look nervous, Albert. You got anything in this vehicle I need to know about? Drugs? Weapons? Large amounts of cash?" "No, officer. I am perfectly calm and there is no contraband in the vehicle. May I ask why I was pulled over?" Higgins leaned closer, his face twisting into a scowl. "You swerved. Almost ran me off the road back there. It was a blatant, fabricated lie." Reynolds's grip on the steering wheel tightened just a fraction of a millimeter. He knew exactly what this was. He had spent his life fighting for a country that still, in quiet corners like this, harbored men who viewed him as a lesser being. "I see," Reynolds said softly. The calmness of his response seemed to enrage Higgins further. The officer spun on his heel, marching back to his cruiser to run the name, leaving Reynolds sitting in the cold night air. The trap was set, and Higgins was determined to find a reason to spring it. Inside the cruiser, Higgins punched Albert Reynolds's name into the mobile data terminal. The screen blinked green. No warrants, no criminal history, clean driving record, valid license. Higgins slammed his palm against the steering wheel. "Nothing. Guy is squeaky clean. So we write a warning and cut him loose?" Rookie Miller asked, hoping to de-escalate the situation. The vibe of the stop was making him deeply uncomfortable. The driver hadn't done anything wrong, and his demeanor was completely non-threatening. "No," Higgins growled. "I know his type. Arrogant. Thinks he's untouchable. Squeaky clean just means he hasn't been caught yet. I'm going to toss the car. I guarantee you we find something." "Clayton, we don't have probable cause to search," Miller protested weakly. "I thought I smelled marijuana when he rolled down the window," Higgins said, staring dead at Miller. The implication was clear. Back my play, or your career here is over before it starts. Miller swallowed hard and looked away. "Right. Marijuana." Higgins marched back to the Tahoe. He didn't hand the license back. Instead, he slapped his hand against the roof of the SUV. "All right, Albert, Step out of the vehicle." Reynolds didn't move immediately. "Officer, my record is clear. You have my license. I have answered your questions. Am I receiving a citation for the alleged lane violation, or am I free to go?" "You're stepping out of the damn car!" Higgins yelled, his hand returning to his holster. "I smell marijuana coming from the cabin. That gives me probable cause to search this vehicle. Now step out, or I will drag you out." Reynolds looked at Higgins. It was the same look he gave to insubordinate colonels who tried to cut corners during combat exercises, a look of absolute, piercing authority. "Officer, I do not smoke. I have never smoked. There is no marijuana in this vehicle. I do not consent to any searches of my property. I am asking for a supervisor to be called to this location immediately." The invocation of rights, the demand for a supervisor, the utter lack of subservience. It broke Higgins's fragile ego. "I'm the only supervisor you need!" Higgins screamed. He grabbed the handle, yanked the heavy door open, and lunged into the cabin. He grabbed Reynolds by the collar of his University of Michigan sweatshirt and yanked outward. Reynolds, a man who maintained a rigorous physical fitness regimen, could have easily broken Higgins's wrist and neutralized him in 3 seconds flat. But his discipline held. He knew the statistics. He knew what happened to black men who fought back against police on dark highways, regardless of who was in the right. He went limp, allowing Higgins to haul him out of the vehicle so that the officer couldn't claim he resisted. Higgins slammed Reynolds face first against the side of the Tahoe. The metal was cold against Reynolds's cheek. "Put your hands behind your back," Higgins barked, driving a knee into Reynolds' hamstring. Reynolds complied silently, bringing his hands to the small of his back. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite viciously into his wrists. Higgins clamped them down hard, ratcheting them tight enough to restrict the blood flow. "Officer Miller," Reynolds said, his voice strained but perfectly steady, addressing the rookie who was standing frozen a few feet away. "Please note the time. Please note that I am fully compliant. And please note that your partner is initiating an unlawful arrest without probable cause." "Shut your mouth!" Higgins shoved Reynolds's head against the glass. "Watch him, Miller. I'm tossing the car." Higgins spent the next 20 minutes tearing apart the interior of the pristine Tahoe. He threw Reynolds's neatly folded civilian clothes onto the dusty gravel. He unzipped a leather shaving kit and dumped the contents on the driver's seat. He tore up the floor mats. Nothing. Absolutely nothing illegal. Then Higgins popped the trunk. Sitting next to a set of Callaway golf clubs was a heavy, matte black Pelican case. It was secured with 2 heavy-duty steel padlocks. "Well, well, well," Higgins muttered, his eyes lighting up. "What do we have here?" He dragged the case out and dropped it onto the asphalt. He turned to Reynolds. "What's in the box, Artie? The product? The cash? Give me the keys." Reynolds turned his head to look at the officer. The case contained highly classified Department of Defense briefing materials regarding a joint forces operation in the Indo-Pacific. It was illegal for anyone without top-secret/SCI clearance to even look at the folders, let alone a corrupt, small-town cop. "Officer Higgins," Reynolds said, reading the man's name tag. "That case contains sensitive materials. It is the property of the United States government. You are not authorized to open it. I strongly advise you to stop what you are doing, remove these cuffs, and call your police chief." Higgins laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Property of the U.S. government? What, you a secret agent now? You expect me to believe a guy like you is working for the feds?" "I expect you to follow the law," Reynolds replied. Higgins tried to pry the locks with a crowbar from his cruiser, but the hardened steel wouldn't budge. Frustrated, sweating, and humiliated that his massive drug bust was evaporating before his rookie's eyes, Higgins made the worst decision of his life. "You're under arrest," Higgins declared, storming over to Reynolds. "On what charge?" Reynolds asked calmly. "Obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and suspicion of transporting contraband," Higgins spat. "We're impounding the vehicle. We'll get a warrant and cut that box open at the station. Get in the cruiser." Higgins grabbed Reynolds by the arms and forcefully shoved him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the Ford Interceptor. As the door slammed shut, sealing him in the cage, Reynolds closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had given Higgins every opportunity to walk away. He had offered the off-ramps, but the officer had chosen to accelerate over the cliff. Reynolds mentally shifted gears. The time for de-escalation was over. It was time for a surgical strike. The ride to the Oakhaven Police Department took less than 15 minutes, but Higgins spent the entire duration lecturing Miller from the front seat, intentionally raising his voice so Reynolds could hear through the plexiglass divider. "This is how real police work is done, Miller," Higgins boasted. "These guys think they can cruise through our town with their fancy cars and their locked boxes, thinking we're just dumb hicks. We're going to crack that case open, find the dope, and make the front page of the county paper." In the back, Reynolds sat in uncomfortable silence, his shoulders aching from the unnatural angle of his cuffed wrists. He watched the small town of Oakhaven roll by, a faded main street, a couple of closed diners, a hardware store, and finally, a low-slung, cinder-block building that served as the police headquarters. They hauled Reynolds inside. The station was quiet, manned only by a sleepy desk sergeant named Barnes. "What do we got, Clayton?" Barnes asked, looking over the rim of his reading glasses as Higgins shoved Reynolds toward the booking desk. "Got a live one. Refused a search, acting suspicious. Got a locked safe in his trunk he won't open. Impound the Tahoe. I'm writing up the warrant request for a judge right now. Empty your pockets," Barnes sighed, sliding a plastic bin across the counter. Reynolds' cuffs were removed. He massaged his bruised wrists, his expression utterly blank. He reached into his pockets. He placed his keys, a pack of peppermint gum, and a heavy tungsten pen into the bin. Barnes opened Reynolds' wallet to inventory the cash. He pulled out the civilian driver's license. He didn't look at the other cards layered behind it. He didn't see the DOD. He didn't notice the insignia. "Take his shoelaces and his belt. Put him in cell 3, Higgins ordered. "I'm going to go get my crowbar. Warrant or no warrant, I'm finding out what's in that box. I would strongly advise against tampering with that case, Officer Higgins," Reynolds said, his voice echoing in the drab booking room. "If you break those seals, you will be committing a federal felony." "Throw him in the cage, Barnes," Higgins sneered, turning his back. Reynolds was escorted down a short hallway and locked into a small, cold holding cell. It smelled faintly of bleach and stale sweat. There was a metal bench bolted to the wall and an exposed toilet in the corner. Across the hall, on the wall, hung a heavy metal payphone. Reynolds sat down on the bench. He didn't pace. He didn't yell. He sat with the perfect posture of a man who had endured SERE, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, training. He mentally reviewed the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the jurisdictional boundaries of the Posse Comitatus Act, and the federal statutes regarding the detainment of a high-ranking military official. An hour passed, then 2. The station remained relatively quiet, save for the muffled sound of Higgins swearing from the garage area, as he presumably failed to crack the Pelican case. Finally, footsteps approached the cell. It was Rookie Miller. He looked anxious, carrying a clipboard. "Hey," Miller said softly, looking around to make sure Higgins wasn't nearby. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Higgins is trying to get a judge on the phone for a warrant, but it's late. You have the right to a phone call. You want to call a lawyer or something?" Maybe they can talk some sense into him. Reynolds stood up and walked to the bars. He looked down at the young officer. He saw the hesitation in Miller's eyes, the realization that something was terribly wrong, but lacking the courage to stop it. "I will take my phone call now, Officer Miller," Reynolds said. "But I will not be calling a lawyer." Miller unlocked the cell door and escorted Reynolds across the hall to the wall phone. "Dial 9 to get an outside line," Miller said, stepping back to give him a modicum of privacy. Reynolds picked up the heavy plastic receiver. He didn't dial a 1-800 number for a local attorney. He dialed a highly classified 11-digit sequence. The line clicked. It didn't ring. After 2 seconds, a crisp, professional voice answered. "National Military Command Center. Authenticate." Reynolds shielded his mouth slightly, lowering his voice. "This is Lieutenant General Albert Reynolds. Authentication code, Echo 7, Tango Niner Bravo." There was a brief pause on the line as the DoD supercomputers verified the voice biometric and the rolling access code. "Authentication confirmed, General Reynolds," the duty officer said, the tone immediately shifting to one of utmost deference. "Go ahead, sir. Do we have a situation?" "I need to be patched through to General Jack Stanton, Army Chief of Staff," Reynolds said smoothly. "Wake him up if you have to. Patch him to this number on a secure bridge." "Stand by, sir." 60 seconds later, a gruff, sleep-heavy voice came on the line. "Art? It's 2 in the morning. You're supposed to be on leave, fishing in the Outer Banks. Are the Russians moving on the border?" "No, Jack, nothing like that," Reynolds said, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. "I'm currently sitting in a holding cell at the Oak Haven County Police Department in Virginia." There was dead silence on the line. Then General Stanton's voice returned, wide awake and razor-sharp. "Say again, Art. You're in a local jail. Was there an accident?" "No accident. I was subjected to a pretextual traffic stop by an aggressive local officer. No probable cause. He escalated, illegally searched my rental vehicle and cuffed me. I am currently being held without legitimate charges." Stanton let out a long, slow breath over the phone. "Are you injured?" "Bruised wrists, nothing broken. But Jack," he impounded the vehicle, "and he has my secure Pelican case, the one containing the Pacific Fleet deployment briefs." The silence that followed was terrifying. When Stanton spoke again, his voice was cold enough to freeze nitrogen. "He has top-secret classified materials. He's currently in their garage, trying to pry it open with a crowbar," Reynolds confirmed, his eyes locking onto Rookie Miller, who was watching him with growing unease. "Art, you give me the word, and I will scramble a team from Quantico so fast the sonic boom will shatter their windows," Stanton growled. "I'll have the FBI hostage rescue team kick their doors in." "No," Reynolds said calmly. "Keep it clean, Jack. I don't want a shootout. I want accountability. Contact the Provost Marshal. Send a military police detachment from Fort Belvoir. Get the Department of Justice on the line, specifically the Civil Rights Division. And Jack?" "Yeah, Art? Bring the heavy hitters. I want this precinct fully locked down before sunrise. I want this handled by the book, so thoroughly that these officers never wear a badge again." "Copy that, General," Stanton said, dropping the informal tone, shifting entirely into wartime command mode. "ETA for advance elements is 45 minutes. Do not let them open that case. Hang tight, Art. The cavalry is coming." Reynolds hung up the phone. The loud clack of the receiver hitting the cradle echoed in the quiet hallway. Miller stepped forward, his face pale. Did you get your lawyer?" Reynolds turned around. He looked at the rookie, then down the hall toward the garage where Higgins was still banging away. "No, Officer Miller," Reynolds said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the impending storm. "I called my employer. They're on their way to sort this out." Reynolds walked back into his cell and pulled the door shut behind him. He sat back down on the metal bench, laced his fingers together, and waited for the wrath of the United States military to descend upon Oakhaven County. In the poorly lit garage of the Oakhaven Police Department, Officer Clayton Higgins was losing his mind. He stood over the matte black Pelican case, his chest heaving, a sheen of sweat coating his forehead. At his feet lay a bent crowbar, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters with chipped blades, and a power drill with a snapped titanium bit. The case remained completely impenetrable. "Son of a bitch!" Higgins yelled, kicking the side of the container. It barely moved, heavy with whatever secrets it held. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, his frustration morphing into a gnawing paranoia. Who the hell drove around with a case engineered like a bank vault? He stormed back into the booking area. Rookie Officer Brent Miller was sitting on a stool near the dispatch desk, nervously biting his fingernails. Desk Sergeant Barnes was pouring a stale cup of coffee. "Barnes, get Judge Peterson on the phone," Higgins barked, pointing a trembling finger. "Wake him up. Tell him I need a sledgehammer warrant for this box. I've got a suspected high-level trafficker in cell 3 refusing to cooperate." Barnes looked at the clock. It was 3:15 a.m. "Peterson hates being woken up for anything less than a homicide, Clayton. You sure about this? The guy back there doesn't look like a trafficker." "I don't care what he looks like." Higgins slammed his palm on the counter. "Call the judge." Before Barnes could reach for the receiver, the dispatch console lit up. It wasn't a standard 911 call. It was the emergency interagency frequency, a line that almost never flashed unless there was a multi-state catastrophe. Barnes pressed the blinking red button. "Oakhaven Dispatch. Oakhaven Dispatch. This is the Virginia State Police, Troop Division 1, operating on behalf of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Be advised, all Oakhaven units are to stand down immediately. Do not leave the premises. Acknowledge." Barnes froze, his hand hovering over the console. He looked at Higgins, the color draining from his face. "State Police. Copy that. We are holding our positions. What is the nature of the emergency?" "Nature of emergency is a joint federal and military operation. Do not touch the prisoner in holding. Do not approach the impounded vehicle. ETA is less than 2 minutes. Out." "Military?" Higgins scoffed, trying to mask the sudden icy knot forming in his stomach. "What the hell is this? Miller, did you call someone?" "I didn't do anything," Miller stammered, stepping away from Higgins. "He just made his one phone call, that's it." Across town, in a sprawling suburban house, Oakhaven Police Chief Thomas Weber was jolted awake by the shrill ringing of his private cell phone. Weber was a political survivor, a man who liked keeping his small department off the radar. He fumbled for the phone, squinting at the caller ID. It was a Washington, D.C. area code. "Weber," he grumbled. "Chief Thomas Weber. This is Assistant Attorney General Richard Hayes, Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice. I have the special agent in charge of the Richmond FBI field office and the Provost Marshal for the Military District of Washington on this line." Weber sat straight up in bed, instantly wide awake. Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "Chief Weber, exactly 7 minutes ago, the Pentagon informed me that one of your officers abducted a 3-star United States Army general, illegally impounded his vehicle, and is currently attempting to break into a classified Department of Defense container." Weber's blood ran cold. The silence in his bedroom was deafening. "General? Sir, there must be some mistake. We haven't arrested any military personnel. The officer's name is Clayton Higgins," the assistant AG snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He is holding Lieutenant General Albert Reynolds. If your officer successfully breaches that container, he will be committing a violation of the Espionage Act. I have a federal task force pulling up to your station right now. I suggest you get down there and pray your officer hasn't done anything to harm that general, or your department won't exist by sunrise." The line went dead. Weber dropped his phone onto the mattress, his hands shaking violently. He knew Higgins. He knew the man's reputation for pushing boundaries, for racially profiling drivers on Route 29. Weber had looked the other way, because Higgins brought in revenue through seized assets. "Oh, God," Weber whispered, scrambling out of bed and grabbing his pants. He pulled over the Pentagon. Back at the station, the faint, rhythmic thumping of heavy rotor blades began to vibrate the cinder-block walls. It started as a low hum and quickly built into a deafening roar. Higgins drew his weapon, his eyes darting frantically toward the front doors. "What is that?" Miller yelled over the noise, covering his ears. "Helicopter," Barnes said, staring out the reinforced front window into the parking lot. His jaw dropped. "Clayton, put the gun down. Put it down right now." Through the window, Higgins saw them. They weren't local squad cars. Half a dozen black, armored Chevy Suburbans screeched into the small parking lot, blocking every exit. Dust kicked up violently as a massive, dark-painted UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter hovered mere feet above the adjacent empty lot, its powerful downwash bending the street lamps. Dozens of men in heavy tactical gear, armed with compact assault rifles, poured out of the vehicles. Half of them wore the dark windbreakers of the FBI. The other half wore OCP camouflage with bold black letters across their chests. CID, Military Police. Higgins's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped his Glock. The fantasy of the massive drug bust evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization that he had trapped himself in a cage with a sleeping dragon, and the dragon had just woken up. The reinforced double doors of the Oak Haven Police Department were practically blown off their hinges. "FBI, federal agents, hands where we can see them." The lobby was instantly flooded with armed personnel. Red laser sights danced wildly across the drab walls, settling squarely on the chests of the 3 local cops. "Drop the weapon," roared a massive man at the front of the formation, wearing a heavy Kevlar vest over a tailored suit. This was Special Agent in Charge Bradley Walsh. Next to him stood Army Colonel Gregory Hartman, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying discipline. Higgins, paralyzed by shock, didn't immediately drop his gun. He stood frozen, his brain failing to process the overwhelming show of force. Walsh drew his sidearm with blinding speed. "I said drop the weapon, officer! Do it now, or you will be neutralized!" The threat of imminent death finally snapped Higgins out of his trance. He dropped the Glock. It clattered loudly on the linoleum floor. In an instant, 2 FBI tactical agents rushed forward, shoving Higgins against the booking counter and kicking his legs apart. They ripped his duty belt from his waist and slapped heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. "What are you doing?" Higgins shrieked, panic pitching his voice an octave higher. "I'm a police officer. I'm local law enforcement. You have no jurisdiction here." "You're a kidnapper," Colonel Hartman said, stepping forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a lethal weight. "You have illegally detained a superior commanding officer of the United States Armed Forces. Where is General Reynolds?" Miller, whose hands were raised so high his shoulders ached, pointed a trembling finger down the hallway. "Cell 3, sir. He's in cell 3. Hartman nodded to 2 heavily armed military police investigators. "Secure the general. Now." The MPs jogged down the hall. A few seconds later, the metallic clank of the cell door unlocking echoed through the station. The entire lobby fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as Lieutenant General Albert Reynolds walked around the corner. He was still wearing his faded University of Michigan sweatshirt and jeans, but the aura of authority he projected was absolute. He walked with a calm, measured stride, unaffected by the chaos that had just descended upon the building. The moment Reynolds stepped into the lobby, Colonel Hartman snapped to attention, executing a flawless, razor-sharp salute. Every single military police officer in the room immediately followed suit. "General Reynolds, sir," Hartman barked. "Colonel Hartman, CID. The area is secure." Reynolds returned the salute smoothly. "Stand down, Colonel. Thank you for your prompt response." Higgins, currently pinned against the counter by 2 federal agents, twisted his neck to look at Reynolds. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of grey. His eyes widened in absolute, unfiltered horror. Albert. The name he had mocked. The man he had slammed against a Tahoe, handcuffed, and thrown in a cage like a stray dog. "You," Higgins stammered, his bravado entirely broken. "You're a general." Reynolds ignored him completely. He turned his attention to Special Agent Walsh. "Agent Walsh, I presume my vehicle and the classified materials have been secured?" "Yes, General," Walsh replied respectfully. "My agents have cordoned off the garage. The Pelican case appears to have minor exterior damage from a blunt instrument, but the locks are completely intact. The seals are unbroken." "Excellent," Reynolds nodded. "I trust the Department of Justice will handle the processing of these individuals?" "Absolutely, sir. We have federal warrants for Officer Clayton Higgins for deprivation of rights under color of law, unlawful detention, and attempted tampering with classified federal property." Walsh turned to look at Higgins with deep disgust. "He's looking at 20 years in federal prison before we even get to the civil suits." Just then, the front doors burst open again. Chief Thomas Weber rushed in, out of breath, his uniform shirt half untucked. He stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the scene. The FBI agents, the heavily armed military police, his rookie looking terrified, his veteran officer in cuffs, and the tall, imposing black man standing calmly in the center of it all. "General Reynolds," Weber gasped, stepping forward, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "Sir, I am Chief Weber. I cannot apologize enough for this catastrophic misunderstanding. If you'll just allow me to handle this internally." "Chief Weber," Reynolds interrupted, his voice resonant and commanding. "There is no misunderstanding here. Your officer executed a textbook pretextual stop based on racial profiling. He fabricated evidence, committed an unlawful assault, and attempted to breach highly classified national security assets." Weber swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his neck. "Sir, Higgins is a rogue element. This doesn't reflect my department." "It reflects a severe failure of leadership, Chief," Reynolds countered smoothly. "I spent 3 hours in your holding cell. During that time, I accessed the public records of this department on my mobile device before it was confiscated. Officer Higgins has 22 formal complaints against him for excessive force and discriminatory policing in the last 4 years. You dismissed every single one of them." Weber shrank back as if he had been slapped. "You tolerated a predator because he wore a badge," Reynolds continued, stepping closer to the chief. "You allowed a man who views the citizens he has sworn to protect as enemy combatants to patrol your streets. As of tonight, that ends. The Department of Justice is taking over your precinct. Every arrest Higgins has made will be audited by federal prosecutors. Every asset you have seized will be investigated." Reynolds turned back to Higgins, who was practically hyperventilating against the desk. For the first time all night, Reynolds addressed him directly. "You told me on the highway that you were the only supervisor I needed," Reynolds said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I hope you maintain that confidence when you are answering to a federal judge. Take him out of my sight." "Move!" the FBI agent barked, hauling Higgins toward the door. The officer's legs gave out, and he had to be practically dragged out of his own station, crying openly as he passed the very cage he had locked Reynolds in just hours prior. Reynolds looked at Rookie Miller, who was standing frozen against the wall. "Officer Miller." Miller flinched. "Yes, sir." You knew what was happening was wrong. I saw it in your eyes. But you lacked the courage to intervene, Reynolds said softly. A uniform doesn't make you a good man. Action does. Think very carefully about whether you are meant to wear that badge. Reynolds walked out of the station, flanked by the MPs. The crisp October night air felt good on his face. As he approached his Tahoe, surrounded by federal agents securing the perimeter, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and started the engine. The nightmare for Albert Reynolds was over. But for Clayton Higgins, Thomas Weber, and the corrupt system of Oak Haven County, the true devastation was just beginning. By dawn, the small town of Oak Haven, Virginia, was no longer a sleepy municipality. It was a federal crime scene. The rising sun illuminated a fleet of satellite news trucks lined up along Route 29. Word had leaked out of the Pentagon press office, intentionally and with surgical precision. The headlines splashed across every major morning network from New York to Los Angeles. Rogue police department raided by FBI after false arrest of three-star Army general. Inside the Oak Haven police headquarters, the atmosphere was chaotic but highly organized. Special agent in charge Bradley Walsh had established a temporary command center in what used to be the department's break room. Over 40 federal agents, forensic accountants, and military investigators were systematically dismantling the precinct's entire history. Every filing cabinet was emptied. Every computer hard drive was cloned. Decades of dash cam footage, radio logs, and internal memos were boxed up in crisp, white banker boxes. Chief Thomas Weber sat in his own office, though he was no longer in charge of it. He was sweating through his uniform shirt, flanked by two stone-faced FBI agents. Across the desk sat Assistant Attorney General Richard Hayes, who had taken a red-eye flight from D.C. to personally oversee the decapitation of the department. Chief Weber, Hayes said, his voice calm but laced with venom. He dropped a thick, printed stack of emails onto the desk. My cyber division has been going through your internal communications for exactly 4 hours. Do you know what they found? Weber swallowed dryly. Mr. Hayes, I can assure you that Officer Higgins's actions— Save the script, Hayes interrupted, holding up a hand. We found a coordinated, department-wide mandate to target out-of-state luxury vehicles driven by minorities. We found emails from you, specifically instructing your officers to leverage asset forfeiture laws to seize cash and vehicles to fund your department's pension plan. You weren't running a police force, Chief. You were operating a state-sanctioned highway robbery syndicate. That is a mischaracterization of standard interdiction protocols, Weber tried to argue, though his voice was shaking. Hayes leaned forward. You arrested the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations for the United States Army. Your officer attempted to breach a Level 4 cryptographic transport container holding Pacific Fleet deployment schedules. The Secretary of Defense was woken up at 3 a.m. because of your greed. You are not facing a civil rights lawsuit, Chief. You are facing a federal RICO indictment. Stand up. Weber blinked, stunned. Stand up. I have a town to protect. The Oak Haven Police Department no longer exists, Hayes stated coldly. The Virginia State Police and the County Sheriff are assuming all patrol duties in this jurisdiction, effective immediately. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law. As Weber was frog-marched out the front doors, past the flashing cameras of the National Press Corps, the final pillar of Oak Haven's corrupt regime crumbled. 50 miles away, inside the sterile, windowless interview room of the Alexandria Federal Detention Center, Clayton Higgins was experiencing a psychological freefall. Stripped of his badge, his gun, and his uniform, Higgins wore a bright orange high-visibility jumpsuit. He sat at a steel table, shivering slightly in the over-air-conditioned room. Across from him sat a visibly exhausted federal public defender named Peter Gannon. "I need you to understand the reality of your situation, Clayton," Gannon said, rubbing his temples. "You are not in state court. You are in the federal system, and the United States government is treating you like a domestic terrorist." "I made a mistake." Higgins slammed his cuffed hands against the table. "I thought he was a drug runner. He was driving a Tahoe. He gave me attitude. He wouldn't let me search the car. How was I supposed to know he was a general?" "Because he handed you a valid driver's license with his real name, and when you ran it, he came back with 0 criminal history," Gannon fired back, losing his patience. "Because he told you he was carrying federal property, because he invoked his rights calmly and clearly. You ignored all of it because you wanted to play cowboy." Gannon opened a manila folder. "Let's review the charges. Deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, assault. And here is the nail in your coffin. Clayton, attempted espionage." Higgins's eyes widened in sheer panic. "Espionage! I didn't spy on anyone. I was trying to find dope." "You attempted to breach a top-secret Department of Defense container. Ignorance of what was inside is not a defense under the Espionage Act. The military prosecutors are arguing that by attempting to open that case in an unsecured environment, you willfully endangered national security. The Department of Justice is refusing to offer a plea deal. They are asking for 25 years in a federal penitentiary." Higgins buried his face in his hands, a loud, ragged sob echoing in the small room. The arrogant predator who had stalked Route 29 for years was completely gone, replaced by a broken man terrified of the consequences he had finally summoned. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Potomac River, the atmosphere inside the Pentagon was distinctly different. Lieutenant General Albert Reynolds stood by the reinforced windows of his E-ring office, looking out over the Washington Monument. He was back in his Class A uniform, the 3 silver stars gleaming on his epaulets, his chest heavy with rows of colorful ribbons and medals. The door opened behind him. General Jack Stanton, the Army Chief of Staff, walked in holding a cup of black coffee. "The FBI just confirmed that Chief Weber is in custody," Stanton said, taking a seat at the polished mahogany conference table. "The Oak Haven Department has been entirely disbanded. The DOJ is auditing every single conviction, stemming from arrests made by Higgins and his shift supervisors." Reynolds turned away from the window. "What about the rookie, Officer Miller?" "Cooperating fully," Stanton replied. He gave the FBI a sworn statement detailing Higgins's entire fabrication of the traffic stop. He resigned his commission this morning, said he didn't deserve to wear the badge if he couldn't stop something like that from happening. Reynolds nodded slowly. "Good. At least one of them had a conscience, even if he found it too late." Stanton took a sip of his coffee. "You know, Art, when you called me from that payphone, I thought you were kidding. I've known you for 20 years. You survived Fallujah. You survived the Korangal Valley. And you get taken down by a jumped-up traffic cop in rural Virginia." "It's not a joke, Jack," Reynolds said, his voice lowering, the weight of the experience settling over him. "I have 3 stars on my collar. I have the direct ear of the president. And none of that mattered when I was sitting in that driver's seat in civilian clothes. He didn't see a general. He saw a target." Reynolds walked over and sat across from Stanton. "We train our soldiers to have discipline, to de-escalate, to adhere to strict rules of engagement in active war zones. If my soldiers acted the way Higgins acted in a hostile country, they would be court-martialed and sent to Leavenworth. Yet men like him are given a badge and a gun, and told to police their own communities with absolute impunity." Stanton remained silent for a long moment. "So, what do you want to do, Art?" "I want to testify," Reynolds said, his eyes locking onto Stanton's. "I want to take the stand at his sentencing. I want him to look at the man he tried to destroy, and I want the record to show exactly what happens when power is left unchecked." 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, was packed to absolute capacity. The gallery was filled with journalists, civil rights advocates, military personnel, and victims of the Oak Haven Police Department who had driven hours just to witness this moment. Officer Clayton Higgins sat at the defense table. He had lost 30 pounds. His skin was pale, and his hands trembled continuously as they rested on the polished oak wood. He wore an ill-fitting grey suit provided by his public defender, a far cry from the tactical gear and polished badge he used to wear like a crown. The presiding judge, the Honourable Margaret Winston, was a formidable woman known for her zero-tolerance policy toward public corruption. She peered over her reading glasses at the defense table, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Higgins," Judge Winston said, her voice projecting clearly through the massive courtroom, "you have pled guilty to 2 counts of deprivation of rights under colour of law, 1 count of false imprisonment, and 1 count of reckless endangerment of classified materials. Before I pass sentence, the prosecution has called 1 victim impact witness." Assistant Attorney General Richard Hayes stood up. "The government calls Lieutenant General Albert Reynolds." A hush fell over the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the gallery opened. General Reynolds walked down the center aisle. He was in full dress uniform. Every footstep echoed with precision. As he passed the gallery, 2 rows of military officers who had come to support him stood at attention. Reynolds took the witness stand. He swore the oath, his voice deep and steady. He did not look at Higgins. He looked directly at Judge Winston. "General Reynolds," Hayes began, "can you describe the events of that night and the impact they have had on you?" "The events are a matter of public record, Mr. Hayes," Reynolds said calmly. "I was stopped without cause. I was assaulted. I was detained unlawfully. But the impact of that night extends far beyond my personal inconvenience." Reynolds finally turned his head. His piercing gaze locked onto Clayton Higgins. Higgins physically shrank in his chair, unable to maintain eye contact, staring down at his trembling hands. "When I took the oath to defend the Constitution of the United States," Reynolds continued, his voice echoing in the silent room, "I understood that I might be called upon to face enemies of freedom on foreign soil. What I did not expect was to find an enemy of freedom wearing the uniform of an American police officer." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "Mr. Higgins did not pull me over because of a traffic violation. He pulled me over because he felt entitled to dominate someone he viewed as inferior. He weaponized the law to serve his own ego. He assumed that because we were on a dark, isolated road, he possessed absolute power." Reynolds turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I command soldiers who hold the power of life and death in their hands every single day. The foundation of that power is accountability. When accountability vanishes, authority becomes tyranny. Clayton Higgins is a tyrant. He used his badge as a shield to terrorize citizens, believing he would never be caught. I am asking this court to remind him, and anyone else who shares his mindset, that no one is above the law." Reynolds stepped down from the stand. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, an immovable force that had utterly crushed whatever defense Higgins's lawyer had prepared. Judge Winston adjusted her glasses. She looked down at Higgins. "Clayton Higgins," she began, her voice ringing with finality. "You betrayed the public trust. You engaged in a pattern of predatory behavior that culminated in the assault and abduction of a decorated military officer. You endangered national security out of sheer ignorance and arrogance. Higgins squeezed his eyes shut, a tear slipping down his cheek. "You believed that the law didn't apply to you," Judge Winston continued. "You are about to find out exactly how rigorously it applies. On the charges of civil rights violations and false imprisonment, I sentence you to 180 months in federal prison. On the charge of reckless endangerment of federal property, I sentence you to an additional 60 months to be served consecutively." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. 20 years. Federal time. No parole. "You are remanded into the custody of the United States Marshals." Judge Winston struck her gavel. The sharp crack sounded like a gunshot. "Court is adjourned." Two heavy-set U.S. Marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Higgins by the arms. They pulled his arms behind his back and snapped the heavy steel handcuffs over his wrists, the exact same way he had cuffed General Reynolds 6 months prior. As Higgins was led out of the courtroom, shuffling toward a future confined to a concrete cell, General Albert Reynolds walked out the front doors of the courthouse. The Virginia sun was shining brightly. The nightmare was over. The predator had been caged, and a dark, corrupt stretch of Route 29 was finally safe. If this story of absolute karma and justice sent chills down your spine, you are not alone. It's a powerful reminder that true authority isn't about the power you wield, but the restraint and integrity you show when no one is looking. Clayton Higgins thought he was untouchable, but he learned the hard way that nobody is above the law. If you loved this dramatic breakdown of accountability,